Hi, LEVIASYNTH from ASM is their next-generation polysynth. Its interface and effects resemble Hydrasynth in many ways, but the oscillator structure and workflow is totally different and new. It's got 8 oscillators, 13 envelopes, and an analog filter per voice. It's got 16 voices and is bitimbral, a new sequencer, and plenty of other updates throughout. Like Hydrasynth, the keyboard version has a keybed with polyphonic aftertouch and a wide ribbon controller. That said, LEVIASYNTH isn't a Hydrasynth Mark II. Some features have been removed to make way for new ones. For example, a very interesting algorithm crossfade mode. In this video, I'll take an in-depth look at what makes it special and pros and cons compared to the competition. I'll also upload multi-samples of it to my Patreon so you can get a taste of its sounds at home. Before I start, a quick disclosure. ASM sent me these synths. Other than that, no money changed hands. They have no say over the content of this video and don't get to see it before it's published. Okay, let's start with a look at the two versions of LEVIASYNTH. ASM is releasing a keyboard and a desktop. Both have the same exact synth engine. 16 voices, are bitimbral. They share most of the same buttons and controls and workflow, and are preset compatible. The differences are that the keyboard version has a 5-octave polyphonic aftertouch keyboard, meaning that it detects pressure for each key separately, as opposed to 16 velocity and pressure-sensitive pads on the desktop version. And these can also be used alongside the sequencer, something the keyboard doesn't have physical controls for. The keyboard version of LEVIASYNTH also has a 4-octave ribbon controller, which can be used for pitch bends, as a mod source, or as a playable interface in theremin mode. You can play it in quantized or unquantized mode. In unquantized mode, it's up to you to get the tuning right. The ribbon isn't velocity or pressure sensitive though. While the desktop is packed with controls, the keyboard version has a few extra knobs and buttons in the arpeggiator/sequencer section. You can perform many of these functions on the desktop as well. You just need to do them with soft buttons or virtual buttons on screen. In sequencer mode, there's no direct equivalent to these knobs on screen, but similar controls are available within the sequencer. Then connectivity-wise, the keyboard has both a small and large headphone output up front with a dedicated level control, whereas the headphone jack on the desktop is on the back. Beside that, the connectivity is the same. The keyboard also has mod and pitch bend wheels, something the desktop does not. And then a question you're likely asking yourself is, how are the LEVIASYNTHs different from the original Hydrasynth? While LEVIASYNTH builds on Hydrasynth in many ways, it's not replacing it, and Hydrasynth isn't being discontinued. The biggest difference is in the oscillator section. LEVIASYNth now has 8 oscillators, each with its own envelope, and the oscillators can all now modulate or mutate each other in Hydrasynth terms using a bunch of different algorithms, or using a totally open matrix layout of modulators and carriers, whereas in comparison, Hydrasynth has a more or less fixed layout of oscillators and mutants or mutators. The modulation or mutation options, by the way, aren't entirely identical. There's some overlap, but most notably, LEVIASYNTH does not include Hydrasynth's wavescan mode. LEVIASYNTH isn't a wavetable synth. Now, you still have hundreds of different waveforms available for each of its 8 oscillators, and you can set these to anything you like, and even crossfade between them if you like, but it's not as easy and immediate as it is on Hydrasynth. That said, you can have a LEVIASYNTH preset morph between 8 different algorithms. So you can look at it as an algorithm table synth as opposed to a wavetable synth. Also, Hydrasynth has a dedicated ring mod and noise generator. There's actually no noise generator in LEVIASYNth, at least not as of the current firmware, but there's no shortage of ways to get metallic sounds or noise out of LEVIASYNth. The next big difference is the filters. Hydrasynth has 2 multi-mode filters per voice, and you can arrange them in series or in parallel, whereas LEVIASYNTH has a single digital filter and a single analog filter. The analog filter only has 1 mode, low pass 24 dB per octave with resonance, of course, and drive. And their routing is fixed, the digital filter, into the analog one. The next big difference is hands-on controls, even on the desktop versions. LEVIASYNTH has more controls, 4 knobs for each of the 2 filters, and 4 knobs for control of all 8 envelopes simultaneously for the oscillators. These are bias or offset controls because they control all 8 at once, regardless of how they're set up. The LEVIASYNTHs also have significantly more buttons and ways to access the oscillators, besides letting you access the parameters of each of the oscillators individually, like you can on Hydrasynth. You can also view the oscillator parameters at once in a single view. So for example, look at the waveform for all 8 oscillators, edit their level, their feedback. Some of these have more than 1 page. You'll see the little 1 of 2 or 2 of 2 marking here. And this is particularly useful when editing envelope parameters. It's a great way to see what's going on with all 8 oscillator envelopes at once. This also makes it easy to copy and paste parameters between oscillators. So let's say, for example, that I wanted to set a decay parameter over here and reduce sustain here too, so we'll see it. You can copy these by holding save, touching the first, and any other oscillators I wanted to copy that parameter to. Same goes for decay, 1 touch for copy, and the rest for paste. Another big difference between the two is the addition of a multi-track polyphonic and motion sequencer in LEVIASYNTH, whereas Hydrasynth doesn't have a real sequencer at all, though both in addition have a sequenceable step LFO. So you can go into any LFO on both synths, change its waveform to a step waveform, and then turn on semitone lock, go to step edit, and basically hold the step and add semitone intervals to it, and then point that to pitch. Anyway, you can do this both on LEVIASYNTH and on Hydrasynth. LEVIASYNTH now adds an entire polyphonic sequencer with 2 note tracks and 1 modulation track. Another important difference is bitimbrality. Both LEVIASYNTHs are bitimbral and have 16 voices. Only Hydrasynth Deluxe has similar capabilities. The rest in the Hydrasynth series only have a single timbre with 8 voices. Also new for LEVIASYNTHs is the color touchscreen. As opposed to 5 small black and white OLED screens on the Hydrasynths, you can see we lost these buttons on LEVIASYNTH. Since this is a touchscreen, we now get soft buttons instead of physical buttons. So those are the main differences. Beside that, the workflow is very similar. You've got buttons that point to various synth modules, and then you edit the parameters of that module using the screen encoders. If a module has more than 1 page, you can page up and down. It's exactly the same deal on Hydrasynth. If you can page down, this button lights up. Same deal here. Both Hydrasynths and the LEVIASYNTHs have 4 effects slots: pre-effects, delay, reverb, post-effects, with a selection of effect types per slot. Also on the modulation side, beside the 8 envelopes in the oscillator section, which we'll ignore for a bit, the envelopes and LFOs work in a very similar way. The envelope parameters are also very similar. The envelopes can loop, and the LFOs have a one-shot mode. Both synths have a 32-slot mod matrix, and both synths have 8 macros, which can each point to up to 8 parameters. Beside the mod matrix, both synths also have some pre-existing modulation assignments. So for example, envelope amount, velocity to envelope, poly aftertouch. You can see dotted lines here that give you a hint into what's modulating what. You can store over 1,000 single presets on LEVIASYNTH, and it comes with 4 banks of 128 presets, so around 500 presets populated for singles, and another 5 banks of multi-presets, meaning combos of 2 presets. So 2 banks pre-populated and 640 multi-presets in total. You can edit the multis, by the way, independently, and the colors change to reflect which multi you're editing or both. And macros can point either to both multis or just one of them. In terms of build, all of these feel super solid. And in terms of I/O, they're identical except for the headphones up front, like I mentioned earlier. You've got a single pair of 1/4-inch stereo outputs for both timbres, so no separate outputs, foot switch and expression jacks, MIDI in, out, and through, and USB for MIDI and firmware updates, but not audio. You've also got CV inputs and outputs for a bit of modular connectivity. Then finally, for the overview, the desktop version is rack mountable and comes with rack ears. Okay, let's dive in, and I'll explore LeviaSynth on the desktop just because it fits more nicely in the frame, but things work exactly the same way for both, besides a few exceptions I'll discuss. I also won't cover features that are more or less the same in Hydrasynth and here, like the effects, for example. I'm going to assume you're familiar with that. Anyway, let's start with oscillators. There are 8 of them. Each has 5 pages of parameters because it also includes envelope information. Remember, each oscillator has a companion envelope beside the 5 main envelopes. You can point any envelope, by the way, to any destination, so LeviaSynth does have 13 full envelopes. Anyway, there are hundreds of oscillator shapes, and you can scroll through them quickly by holding Shift and move from group to group. By default, you've got coarse and fine-tune control for oscillator pitch, though you can change the pitch mode to either ratios or just a fixed frequency. For example, for a lot of the cross mods, you might want to choose ratio instead of semitones. Now we're hearing oscillator 1 because in the default algorithm, it and all the rest of the oscillators are carriers, meaning we can just hear their output. If we increase their level, we can see an oscillator's level either on the oscillator page itself, right here on the initial level parameter, or on the levels page, which gives us a bird's eye view of the levels of all 8 oscillators. Let's maybe start with a less harmonically rich sound. If oscillator 1, say, would be a saw, and I wanted a sub-oscillator with oscillator 2, a square sub-oscillator to keep things simple, tune it down an octave. In order to hear it, we'd need to raise the initial level of oscillator 2. If we didn't want an oscillator to just ring out, but rather we wanted it to gradually come in, let's maybe put it at a more interesting interval. Anyway, we're editing oscillator 2. If we didn't want to hear it immediately, but rather we'd want its envelope to bring it in, we would increase the envelope level and then go ahead and edit that envelope. Say, give it a half a second to come in. So we would now hear it come in gradually. So that's one important thing to understand about oscillators and their envelopes. Initial level works kind of like a mixer on any other synth, and then you can also view the envelope levels. This immediacy is part of what makes this synth special. Now, another thing that's tricky but needs to be explained, if I wanted to, say, increase the release time of oscillator 2, I wouldn't really hear that because the VCA envelope cuts everything out immediately. It's kind of like an overarching envelope that sits above these envelopes. So if we did want to hear that, we'd need to go into the VCA envelope, give it some release. We could start hearing the release. Now, another important thing, the level envelope won't impact the sawtooth waveform because its initial level is so high. So say if I wanted the sawtooth to cut off immediately, I'd need to turn its initial level down all the way, then go and edit its envelope level, make sure that its release is set to something short. And now the saw will cut out immediately, but the square will stick around. Another cool feature here, and I'll just init this preset. Since we've got polyphonic aftertouch, it's fun to reduce the initial level, let's say to an extreme. We won't hear anything now, but if we go to the polyphonic aftertouch parameter, then as we press a key, same here, we'll start to hear the oscillator only when we apply pressure. I think we covered a lot of the important oscillator parameters, and I already mentioned feedback earlier, which is always interesting. It can turn a sine wave into a saw, and if pushed even more, as we heard earlier, a saw into noise. And I won't go over all the parameters, but if you want, you can also loop envelopes either a fixed number of times, or just like an LFO. So with so many oscillators, just layering them and bringing them in and out at various times during a sound's life cycle lets us create some very interesting complex sounds. Another example, remember how I said LeviaSynth isn't a wavetable synth, and it isn't, but I've got this preset set up with a bunch of different waveforms and cascading attack decay envelopes, and it sounds something like this as it brings in and out each of the 8 oscillators. Okay, so living in carrier land is nice, but now it's time to graduate to using oscillators as modulators. in one of these algorithms, but let's just pick a simple one, say one where oscillator 2 modulates oscillator 1. In this case, we won't hear oscillator 2 directly, rather we'll hear how it impacts oscillator 1. So we've got oscillator 1 as a simple sine wave. If we go to oscillator 2, we can see that regardless of how we change its waveform, we're not going to hear it unless it starts doing something to oscillator 1. The way we get it to do something is by increasing its level. And the how of what it does is one of these cross-mod modes. So if we give oscillator 2 the simplest of waveforms, just a sine wave, and start with phase modulation. Phase modulation is the classic way that a DX7 works. And the magic here is a combination of exploring different waveforms, different mod depths, and different frequency intervals. So this sounds like a nice, simple modulation, but if we get the frequency difference just a bit off, things will start getting much less polite and metallic. And you can hear this dissonance, which happens when there isn't a harmonic ratio like this one between the modulator and the carrier, and that's where these modes come in. So if we wanted to stick to harmonic ratios, we'd change the pitch mode to ratio, and in this case we're likely to get nice sounds regardless of where we put the pitch knob. Anyway, whole videos can be made about choosing different modulator waveforms, not to mention how we modulate this mod depth parameter as opposed to just moving it manually. And of course, different carrier waveforms. So this is a simple sine wave carrier, but any other waveform will of course change the output of what we do significantly. So that's phase mod. Then there's frequency modulation, which just sounds different depending on, again, the waveforms and what we're up to. So this is phase mod of these two oscillators, and this is frequency mod. And then we can add feedback on top of that, both to the modulator and to the carrier. So again, this depends on the shape of our modulator and carrier. I call this electric razor synthesis. By the way, if we wanted more insanity, we could always choose an algorithm where another oscillator modulates oscillator 2. Here we go. So in this one, for example, we use oscillator 3 to change the waveform of oscillator 2, which then impacts how oscillator 1 sounds. But let's just keep things simple for now. The next cross-mod type is pulse width modulation. Let's go to oscillator 1 and choose a simple square for now, then go back to oscillator 2. And if we increase its level, we get pulse width. Of course, we could modulate this depth and get PWM. Now in this mode and all the other modes to the right, the waveform of the modulator doesn't matter. Just its level and its frequency. So say if we go an octave above, not much happens. Let's maybe go an octave below. Okay. So you can see pulse width modulation behaves differently now. And if we choose a non-harmonic interval, other forms of madness ensue. Feedback, I think, doesn't do anything here either. Right, so it's just frequency and level. Let's move on to the next modulation mode, and that's HTE sync. Let's try this first with a sawtooth as a carrier. Go to oscillator 2. So we get the hard sync style sound. And again, a harmonic ratio might work better. HTE stands for hard to explain, and I think the bit that's hard to explain, or at least non-intuitive, is that modulation level or depth causes the sync effect, not changing the frequency of the carrier. So normally with hard sync, we'd expect this to make the hard sync sound but it doesn't. It's the, like I mentioned, the mod depth. This works, of course, for any oscillator waveform. Let's go for something more different. Hear what this sounds like. Anyway, that's HT sync, and then we've got a few phase distortion modes. These are different ways of squishing and unsquishing waveforms. Yes, I think that's the technical term. So this is what a square squishiness looks like, and there's a saw. Kind of biases it to one side, and let's go for saw pulse. And again, this works for any oscillator waveform. Let's maybe go for a simpler one. So again, pulse and saw and square. So that's the basics of oscillators, levels, and cross mods. Really, the algorithms are, even though they look complex, and they are, different ways of either hearing different oscillators in parallel and making certain oscillators sound more complex, or hearing fewer oscillators in parallel, but giving you more opportunity to change their wave shape over time. A word about the bias controls. So these are a great way to control all the envelopes at once. Let's maybe go back to my Wavetable preset, where it scans through different waveforms. So editing this to make it slower would be a pain. I'd need to go to the delay stages and change those manually, and change the attacks manually and all the decays manually. And there's copy paste, but still it's a bit of a pain. Anyway, a way around this is just to use the bias controls, which will add to one parameter across all oscillators an offset and make them all slower in this case. Anyway, the same would apply to envelope levels, to decay times, and to release times. Moving on, besides choosing an algorithm from one of 144 options, I think, so there are quite a few to choose from. One of the things I like to do here is just to choose an existing factory preset. And if we get out of single mode, go to morph mode, start editing the algo list. Let's say, start with, I think this started on 22 here. And then choose something very different, and then that's pretty different. Let's settle for 3 for now. Anyway, if we wanted, we could now morph between these shapes. So these are fun to explore. And then there's a third algorithmic mode called custom, where you can edit exactly which oscillators you want to hear on the output, and you can hear them all if you like, just by tapping here on the bottom. If we wanted to, by the way, we could just mute all of them and hear them one by one. In this case, we can't disconnect oscillator 1, by the way. But with shift and tap, we can solo various oscillators. Anyway, so yeah, we can point oscillators to the output and also point modulators, oscillators basically to each other. So if you wanted modulator or oscillator 7 to modulate everything, we could just turn everything except modulating itself on. We could also choose between setting initial levels, envelope levels, and the modes for each of the oscillators. So to hear what oscillator 7 does to all these, we'd need to, for example, increase its initial level. And if we wanted it to do what it does differently, we could change its mode from sync to any other mode. Sync works nicely here, I think. Okay, let's move on and continue through the signal chain. The digital filter is very similar to the one on the original Hydrasynth. It's got plenty of modes to explore, including a vowel mode, You can also change the order of the vowels, of course, as expected. You've got a knob to control either drive or morph and increase the resonances. Anyway, that's just the valve filter. I'm not going to go through all the filters. There are so many of them. Low pass modes, band pass modes, high pass modes, SEM style morphing modes. So a filter could morph from low pass to band pass to high pass with or without resonance. So typical good Hydrasynth stuff. So those are the digital filters. We've also got a 24 dB per octave low pass filter with resonance that doesn't seem to reduce bass. And will self-oscillate. And with a pre-drive, will also crunch nicely. And drive works, by the way, on anything you feed the filter. So if we turn down resonance and open the filter all the way up and say put the digital filter in just a simple, let's go for a simple low pass mode with resonance, turn down drive. So this is what it sounds like. Typical R2D2 stuff. And if we increase drive, it's going to get a cold. Speaking of bringing levels up, by the way, if we open up the VCA module, we can see the impact of adding drive or resonance to various pre and post drive levels. And it's up to you if you want to clip or not. If you don't, you can reduce levels. Anyway, those are the filters and the analog VCA, by the way. I won't go through the effects because there have been so many Hydrasynth videos, including mine, that have covered these. But there's a bunch of pre-effects, a delay, and a lovely and endless reverb if you want. Or less endless. Let's talk very briefly about modulation. This too is very similar to Hydrasynth. If you want to assign a mod source to a destination, just find that destination parameter, bring it up on the page, say the filter cutoff, hold the mod source and touch the mod destination. It'll populate a mod slot and you can go ahead and assign a mod depth. The LFOs and envelopes give you plenty of parameters to play with, including the ability to trigger the envelopes using multiple different sources and turning off node on, by the way, if you want, so that playing a note doesn't trigger an envelope. Then there are a few interesting features hidden in the voice menu. So by default, voices are panned in the center, and you can increase panning width, which will pan each voice differently based on one of several modes. Anyway, that's nice. Let's reduce this for now. An interesting stereo option is the oscillator stereo feature. So if I turn it on, you'll notice that nice wide stereo effect. And you may also notice that we now have only 8 voices available to us, meaning as it cycles through the voices, it's not using the second half. Turning this on adds these 2 options to the voice menu. You can increase the detune of the carriers, and you can do a few other crazy things with this. So if we go back into the oscillator menu, you'll notice that we now have a new parameter available to us called pan. So we can now pan individual oscillators. So say put a saw over here, but then put say this, and spoiler, let's go to algorithm 1. So now we're just hearing this oscillator to the right and the saw to the left. So that's cool. And the spoiler was that if we turn oscillator 2 into a modulator, and let's bring oscillator 1 back into the center, we can now choose to also pan modulators, either both or just modulators. So now, back to the oscillators, back to panning, we can now shift which side gets modulated. Both, just the left, just the right, or anything in between. Just remember, this cuts into your voice count. Now, having 8 voices left out of 16 isn't too bad, but if you go into a multi and apply this to both multis, then you'll only have a total of 4 voices available. There are a few other interesting voice options, analog feel, and vintage digital makes the cross mods even grittier. Then you've got a 6th LFO, a vibrato LFO for use with the mod wheel, and a bunch of other features we won't go through. Okay, let's move on and talk about the sequencer and arpeggiator. Now, the keyboard has a distinct advantage here, but I'll keep demonstrating on the desktop. I won't go over all the standard features in the ARP and sequencer, but let's look at a few special ones. Besides the usual suspect modes, you've got a phrase mode, with, I think, up to 64 different phrases. And you can add your own user phrases, which you can import from the sequencer. And if we choose a simple mode, and we'll latch the arpeggiator, then there's an entropy mode, which will gradually rearrange your notes and transpose them. And there's a curious feature called tap rhythm. What this does, if we had a tap tempo button, we could do that. But since we don't, we've got a virtual one. Sorry, right over here. This lets us hold our ARP pattern, but play through it by pressing the virtual tap tempo button. All these buttons, by the way, are available on the keyboard, of course. And then for a brief look at the very extensive sequencer, it has 2 polyphonic note tracks and another automation track. You can step record into the sequencer by hitting Shift and step record. You can either overdub alongside notes in the sequence or overwrite them and just punch in notes. Up to 128 steps. Let's go for this. You could then edit the sequence, go through its different pages, and change the notes, the velocity, the gate, add ratchets, mutes, drift, probability, and various playback rules. You could also play live into a sequence, and if we go into sequence edit, again, we've got these virtual buttons instead of the real ones over there. I could choose to record into track 2, record into track 1, and the automation track, or 2 and the automation track. The 3 tracks run in parallel, but can have different lengths. So you can set a different length for track 2, for track 1, or for the macro track, for the automation track. You can also choose a different playback mode for each of the 3 tracks, different swing per track, different playback rate per track. And if we go back to our virtual buttons, we previously saw how to edit the note tracks, but you can also choose to edit the automation tracks. Automation tracks can automate any of the 8 macros, macro 1, 2, 3, and so on. So that's how this sounds. And the manual says it can also automate pitch bends and aftertouch. That didn't work for me. Maybe it's because I'm on a pre-release firmware, but if that's there when you get this, then great. Then before we head out to the pros and cons, a quick word about the init and random buttons. You can use them in conjunction with pretty much any module, I think. So for example, if I wanted to init an oscillator module, just hit init, and yes, you can. Same goes for randomize. Yes, you can. And Shift obviously does a bunch of things. One of the things it can do is access the most recently accessed page that you were in a given module. So let's say if I was on page 4 of the oscillator module and I only wanted to go to page 4 of the modules, as opposed to jump to page 1, then I would use Shift and press the oscillator button and stay on page 4. Okay, let's talk about pros and cons for Leviasynth. On the pros side, it's not often that a synth brings something new to the synthesis table. Leviasynth's strengths aren't the oscillator count or the envelope count. They're impressive, but we've seen synths like that before. It's how it brings these things together in an interface that makes them usable in a musical sense, along with the algorithm morphing that allows you to extend and manipulate whatever you make. To me, that's the heart of this synth and what makes it interesting. Then on top of that, it adds a very interesting sequencer and arpeggiator, an analog filter, and inherits many of the things that made Hydrasynth popular, like effects, modulation, and this module-based interface. Then the ribbon, theremin, and poly aftertouch are the sugar on top, along with the interesting stereo oscillator mode I mentioned earlier. So those are the pros. On the cons side, even though Leviasynth inherits Hydrasynth's workflow and many of its features, it's different in two important ways. First, Hydrasynth came in at a very aggressive price point, especially the desktop and Explorer. Both Leviasynths come in at a significantly higher price point. Then the second difference, I think that Hydrasynth, relatively speaking, is more right-brained, meaning easy to use. If you want simple oscillators, you've got them here. If you want harmonic complexity, grab a mutant. Here, things are much more open and flexible, but more complex. You can do more in many ways, but you're going to give your left brain a workout. Also, with the lack of wavetable support, at least in the current firmware, wave shaping responsibilities are on you, though you've got plenty to work with hundreds of waveforms and plenty of cross-mod options and matrix connection options. Still, there's no easy out of this by just loading up a wavetable or support for samples or granular either. Also, some Hydrasynth features didn't make it into here, like the dual stereo outputs in Hydrasynth Deluxe or a parallel path for the dual filters. There's also no audio rate filter FM here, which is kind of a bummer in light of the analog filter. Interesting competitors to look at, by the way, are Op6 if you're into custom oscillator cross mods at a more affordable price, though without some of the complex wave shaping and the algorithm morph. Also, Waldorf's Iridium is always looming with its multiple engines, including granular and sampling, and even a multi-operator engine with very interesting capabilities, though not a dedicated interface, which makes editing so many oscillators and envelopes much easier here, which is really, I think, the point of this synth. Then a couple of wishlist features. I'd like to be able to morph between custom algorithms. You can't do that currently. You can only morph among the existing algorithms. And I'd also love to be able to set a custom scale for the oscillators, not just semitone, ratio, or fixed frequency, so that we could modulate pitch through a scale of our choice. So that's it for Leviasynth, a rewarding synth for those willing to invest the time in learning it. I'll upload multi-samples of it to my Patreon so you can get a taste of playing it at home, and that's where you'll also find my ever-expanding book of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks. Hit like if this was useful, ring the YouTube bell below to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.
you.